The fluorescent lights in the kitchen were giving her a headache again. Sophie wiped down the same section of counter for the third time, stalling before she had to go back out there. Table 12 needed water refills. Table 7 was still waiting on their dessert menus. And Table 4, the big private party in the salon, had just sent back their wine because it wasn't cold enough. This was her life now. 28 years old, wearing a uniform that smelled like garlic and desperation, smiling at people who looked through her like she was invisible. Most days she could handle it. Most days she told herself it was temporary, just until she got ahead of the bills. But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the ache in her feet from pulling a double shift. Maybe it was the text from the hospital about her mom's upcoming treatment costs. Or maybe it was the grand piano sitting in the corner of the main dining room, mocking her every time she walked past it. She used to play. Not just play, actually. She used to be good. Really good. Her teacher once said she had the kind of touch that could make a piano weep. That was before the student loans became impossible to pay. Before her father died and left them with nothing but medical debt. Before she had to sell her own piano, the one her grandmother had left her, just to keep the lights on for another few months. That was 3 years ago. 3 years since her fingers had touched ivory keys. 3 years of telling herself it didn't matter, that dreams were luxuries for people who could afford them. Sophie, they need you in the salon. Tony, the manager, appeared beside her looking stressed. He was always stressed on Saturday nights, but tonight he seemed worse. His tie was crooked and there was sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "What's wrong?" she asked, already moving toward the private dining area. "Nothing, just be extra nice, okay?" That's Richard Blackwell in there, the tech guy. He's got half the investor community with him, and if tonight goes well, he's talking about hosting monthly dinners here. "We need this," Sophie nodded. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Blackwell Technologies was on every phone, every laptop, every screen in the city. The man had more money than some small countries. And apparently, he was very particular about his wine temperature. The salon was elegant in that way that made Sophie feel poor. Crystal chandeliers, mahogany panels, fresh orchids on every surface. About 20 people sat around a long table, the kind of people who wore watches that cost more than her yearly salary. They were laughing, drinking, completely at ease in a world she only visited to serve food. She spotted him immediately. Richard Blackwell sat at the head of the table, mid-50s, sharp suit, the kind of presence that commanded attention without asking for it. He was talking to the woman on his right, but his eyes were constantly moving, taking in everything, missing nothing. Sophie did her job. She smiled. She poured water. She took orders for after-dinner drinks. She was invisible the way good waiters were supposed to be. That was fine with her. In and out, no drama, decent tip if she was lucky. Then the piano player didn't show up. She heard Tony's panicked voice on his phone in the hallway. "What do you mean you're sick?" "This is Richard Blackwell. Do you know what that means? Find someone, anyone, I don't care if—" No, I understand, just—" "Okay, fine." Sophie watched from the doorway as Tony stood there, phone in hand, looking like a man watching his career fall apart. The pianist was supposed to provide ambiance. That had been part of the pitch. Elegant dining with live classical music. Blackwell had specifically requested it. She should have stayed quiet. Should have just kept her head down and let Tony figure it out. But something made her step forward. "How bad is it?" Tony looked up, startled. The pianist canceled. "Food poisoning. And his backup is at another gig. I've called everyone I know and it's Saturday night, Sophie. Everyone's booked." "There's a piano in the salon," Sophie said quietly. "Yeah, decorative. Supposed to be played. Now it's just going to sit there looking stupid. And Blackwell is going to know we failed to deliver what we promised." Sophie opened her mouth, then closed it. What was she thinking? She hadn't played in years. Her fingers didn't remember the complex pieces anymore. She'd forgotten more than she remembered. "It would be humiliating. Could you play?" Tony asked suddenly, his eyes brightening with desperate hope. "Didn't you say you used to play piano?" "That was a long time ago. But you could play something, right? Just background music. Nothing fancy. Please, Sophie. I'm dying here." She wanted to say no. Every instinct told her to say no. But then she thought about her mom's medical bills, about the text sitting on her phone with numbers she couldn't afford, about the fact that she needed this job and Tony had been good to her, giving her extra shifts when she needed them. "I'll try," she heard herself say. But I'm really rusty. I can't promise anything. Tony grabbed her arm, relief flooding his face. Thank you. Just anything. Anything is better than nothing. They walked back into the salon together. Sophie's heart was hammering against her ribs. Tony cleared his throat, getting Blackwell's attention. That was when everything changed. Mr. Blackwell, I apologize for the interruption. Our pianist had an emergency, but we've arranged for alternative entertainment. Blackwell looked up, his eyes moving from Tony to Sophie with cold assessment. This is your pianist? Sophie is very talented. She's going to play for us this evening. Sophie wanted to crawl into a hole. The way Blackwell was looking at her, like she was a problem to be solved, made her skin crawl. But then he did something unexpected. He smiled, not a warm smile, more like a shark spotting something interesting in the water. Excellent, he said, standing up. Come here. Sophie approached the table, very aware that 20 pairs of eyes were now watching her. Her uniform suddenly felt cheap. The small stain on her apron from earlier, invisible in the kitchen, felt like a spotlight in this room. Blackwell walked over to the piano in the corner, a beautiful grand that probably cost more than her apartment. He sat down on the bench, patted the space beside him. Sit. I'm sorry. Sit down. Play something for us. Let's see what you've got. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to play quietly in the background while they ate and talked, not perform like a trained seal for their amusement. But Tony was watching from the doorway with pleading eyes, and she could feel the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her shoulders. Sophie sat down at the piano. Her hands were shaking. The keys looked foreign, like she'd never seen them before. Behind her, the conversations had stopped. Everyone was watching now, waiting to see what the waitress could do. Well, Blackwell said, his voice carrying across the silent room. We're waiting. Sophie placed her fingers on the keys and realized she had no idea what she was going to play. Sophie's mind went blank. Completely, utterly blank. She stared at the keys like they were written in a foreign language. Behind her, she could feel Blackwell's presence, waiting. The whole room was waiting. Even the air seemed to be holding its breath. Just play something. Anything. Her fingers found a chord. Then another. Chopin, a nocturne. She'd played it 1,000 times when she was younger. Her teacher had made her practice it until her fingers ached. Surely she could remember this one. The first few notes came out okay. A little stiff, maybe. A little uncertain. But recognizable. She could do this. She just needed to get through it, and then she could disappear back into the kitchen where she belonged. Then she hit the wrong note. Not just slightly off. Completely wrong. The sound jangled in the air like broken glass. She tried to recover, pushing forward, but her fingers weren't cooperating. They kept reaching for keys that should have been there but weren't. Or were they? She couldn't remember. The muscle memory she'd relied on for years had vanished, replaced by panic. Someone in the audience coughed. Someone else shifted in their chair. Sophie felt sweat forming on her forehead. Stop. Blackwell's voice cut through the air like a knife. Sophie's hands froze on the keys. That's not working, he said, his tone matter-of-fact, like he was commenting on the weather. Play something else. Something with more energy. Sophie turned slightly, looking at him. I'm sorry I haven't played in a while. Maybe I should just... I didn't ask for excuses. I asked for music. With energy, go, her cheeks burned. She turned back to the piano, her throat tight. Energy. Okay, she could do energy. There was that Mozart piece, the one that was fast and bright. She'd performed it at a recital once. Got a standing ovation from the parents in the audience. That was 8 years ago. She launched into it, trying to channel confidence she didn't feel. But the piece was harder than she remembered. The tempo was too fast. Her fingers tripped over themselves, stumbling through passages that required precision. The notes that should have sparkled came out muddy and rushed. She was making it worse, not better. No, Blackwell interrupted again, waving his hand dismissively. Classical, not that. Something classical. You know Bach? Beethoven? Sophie wanted to scream. Mozart was classical. But she bit her tongue and nodded. Of course, he wanted the big names. The impressive stuff. She reached into her memory, grasping for something, anything that might satisfy him. She started a Bach prelude. This one she'd actually learned more recently, before she quit lessons. Her fingers found the patterns, the repetitive structures that made Bach feel like mathematics set to music. For about 30 seconds it almost worked. She was playing. Not well, but playing. Then the complex section came, the part where the left hand and right hand wove together in intricate counterpoint. Her left hand hit two notes at once when it should have hit one. The harmony collapsed into dissonance. She tried to fix it, but now both hands were confused, reaching for notes that weren't right. Behind her, someone laughed. Just a quick sound, quickly stifled, but Sophie heard it. Heat flooded her face. Her hands were shaking now, actually shaking on the keys. "Keep going," Blackwell said, but there was something in his voice now. Not quite cruelty, but not kindness either. Testing. He was testing her. She kept going because she didn't know what else to do. Through the doorway, she could see Tony watching, his face pale. The other waitstaff had gathered behind him, watching the disaster unfold. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked relieved it wasn't them up there. Sophie switched pieces again, trying a simpler Beethoven sonata. But simple didn't mean easy, and her confidence was shattered now. Every note felt wrong before she even played it. Her timing was off. Her dynamics were flat. She was just hitting keys now, going through motions, trying to survive until she could escape. "Louder," Blackwell called out. "We can barely hear you." She pressed harder, but that just made the notes sound harsh instead of soft. Nothing was working. This wasn't music. This was torture. A waiter came in with a tray of desserts. The guest's attention shifted, grateful for the distraction. They started talking again, quiet conversations about business and investments. They dismissed her. She'd become background noise, and not even good background noise. Just an awkward situation they were politely ignoring. That somehow felt worse than the laughter. Sophie forced herself through another 5 minutes. Then 10, then 20. Blackwell would occasionally glance over, his expression unreadable, then return to his conversation. He'd sip his wine, check his phone, make a comment to the person next to him. But he didn't tell her to stop. Why wasn't he telling her to stop? Her fingers were getting tired now. Not the good tired from a long practice session, but the exhausted tired of constant tension. Her shoulders ached. Her back hurt from sitting too straight, trying to maintain some dignity while she fumbled through piece after piece. She attempted the Mozart again. Still terrible. Tried a simplified version of a Rachmaninoff prelude she'd once loved. Couldn't even get through the opening. Went back to Chopin. The same nocturne from the beginning. Maybe if she just played it enough times it would come back to her. It didn't. 45 minutes passed. 45 minutes of humiliation served on a silver platter for the entertainment of people who probably thought this whole thing was amusing. The struggling waitress trying to pretend she was something more than she was. Sophie felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She blinked them back hard. She would not cry in front of these people. She would not give them that. But the tears were coming anyway, hot and insistent behind her eyes. Her vision started to blur. Her hands moved on autopilot now, playing nothing in particular, just random notes that maybe formed something resembling music if you didn't listen too carefully. She was about to stop. Just stand up, apologize, and leave. Quit her job if she had to. This wasn't worth it. Nothing was worth this. Then something broke inside her. Not broke like something destroyed. Broke like something opening. Like a door she'd kept locked for 3 years suddenly swinging wide. Why was she doing this? Why was she playing pieces she thought he wanted to hear? Playing the way she thought she was supposed to play? Trying to be impressive when impressive clearly wasn't working? She'd spent 3 years trying to be what other people needed. The reliable daughter. The good employee. The person who didn't complain, who didn't dream, who just got through the day. She'd locked away the part of herself that felt things deeply, because feeling things deeply hurt too much when life kept taking things away. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe that was why nothing was working. She wasn't playing music. She was performing, and there was a difference. Sophie's hands went still on the keys. The room quieted slightly, people noticing the absence of sound. Blackwell looked up from his phone. She closed her eyes and thought about her father, about sitting next to him on the piano bench when she was 7 years old. His hands guiding hers over the keys, about the last time she'd played for him in the hospital, 2 days before he died, about the piece he'd loved most, the one he'd asked her to play at his funeral, Debussy, Clair de Lune. She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. Not for Blackwell, not for the investors, not even for her job, for her father, for herself, For the girl she used to be who believed that music mattered more than money. And this time, something different happened. The first notes of Clair de Lune floated into the air like whispers. Soft, gentle, nothing like the harsh, trying too hard sounds she'd been making for the past 45 minutes. Sophie wasn't thinking about technique anymore, wasn't worried about hitting the right notes or impressing anyone. She was remembering the hospital room with its blue walls and antiseptic smell, her father's hand thin and weak reaching for hers. Play the moon song, he'd said. That's what he'd always called it. The moon song. Her fingers moved across the keys with a tenderness she didn't know she still had. The melody rose and fell like waves, like breathing, like the gentle rhythm of a heart that was learning to feel again. This piece wasn't about speed or showing off. It was about space, about silence, about the notes you didn't play being just as important as the ones you did. She made mistakes, small ones. Her fingers still weren't as nimble as they used to be, but somehow the mistakes didn't matter. They made it more real, more human, like she was having a conversation instead of giving a speech. The room had gone quiet, but Sophie didn't notice at first. She was somewhere else. She was 7 years old, sitting on her father's lap while he guided her hands. She was 15, playing this piece for her school recital and seeing him in the front row with tears in his eyes. She was 25, sitting in a hospital chapel at 3 a.m, playing on an old upright piano while the world fell apart around her. The melody swelled. Not loud but full, like moonlight spreading across water, like grief that had finally found a way to speak. A fork clinked against a plate, but the sound seemed far away. Sophie's eyes were still closed. She didn't want to see the room, didn't want to remember where she was or why she was here. She just wanted to stay in this moment, in this conversation with her father, with herself, with the girl who used to believe that music could heal anything. The piece built to its gentle climax. Her right hand sang out the melody while her left hand supported it with rolling chords. It wasn't perfect. Her technique was rusty, but something else was there now, something that hadn't been there in any of the other pieces she'd tried to play tonight. Truth. She poured everything into those keys. 3 years of exhaustion, the weight of bills she couldn't pay, the shame of dreams abandoned, the loneliness of trying to be strong when she felt like she was drowning, but also the small moments of beauty she'd found. A sunrise on her walk to work, her mother's laugh when they talked on the phone, the feeling of still being alive when some days that felt like enough. The melody began its descent, returning to the quiet whisper where it had started. Sophie played the final phrases with such gentleness it was almost like touching something sacred. The last notes hung in the air, suspended before finally fading into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Sophie kept her eyes closed, her hands resting on the keys, afraid to open her eyes and face whatever was waiting for her. Then she heard it, a single person clapping, slow, steady, then another, then another. The sound built like a wave. Sophie opened her eyes and turned around. Every single person in the room was standing, all 20 of them. They were applauding, not the polite golf clap she'd expected. Real applause, the kind that echoed off the walls and made her chest feel tight. Tears spilled down her cheeks. She couldn't stop them anymore. Didn't want to stop them. She'd spent 3 years not crying, not feeling, not letting herself be vulnerable. And now it all came pouring out while a room full of strangers watched. Blackwell was standing too, but he wasn't clapping. He was just looking at her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he walked forward slowly, deliberately until he was standing right in front of the piano. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to pull herself together. This was it. He was going to tell her to leave. Tell Tony to fire her. Make some cutting comment about waitresses who had delusions of being musicians. But that's not what happened. "I'm sorry," Blackwell said. Sophie blinked. "What?" "I'm sorry," he repeated, and this time his voice was softer, almost gentle. "What I did to you tonight was cruel." The room had gone quiet again. Everyone was watching. "I have a habit of testing people," Blackwell continued, "pushing them to see what they're made of. It's how I've built my career. But tonight I took it too far. I pushed you past your breaking point, and that wasn't fair." Sophie didn't know what to say. This wasn't the script she'd been expecting. Blackwell pulled out one of the dining chairs and sat down, gesturing for Sophie to do the same. She slid off the piano bench and sat across from him, very aware that she was still in her waitress uniform with tears on her face. "My mother was a piano teacher," Blackwell said, his eyes distant like he was seeing something from a long time ago. "We grew up with nothing. I mean nothing. Government housing, food stamps, the works. But my mother had this old upright piano that she'd saved for years to buy. It was the only thing of value we owned." He paused, his fingers tapping the table. "She taught piano lessons in our living room to pay the bills. $20 an hour. She'd teach from 3 in the afternoon until 10 at night, 6 days a week. I'd do my homework at the kitchen table, listening to the same scales over and over again. The same simple songs. Most of her students were terrible. Kids whose parents forced them to take lessons. Adults who thought they could learn in 3 months what takes years." Sophie listened, her heart still pounding. "But every once in a while," Blackwell continued, "she'd get a student who really had something. Real talent, real passion. And when she found those students, she'd light up. She'd stay late with them for no extra money. Give them books from her own collection. She'd tell me, 'Richard, this one's got it. They've got the thing you can't teach.'" He looked directly at Sophie now. "You've got it," he said simply. "What I heard in those last few minutes, that's not something you learn. That's something you are, and I've been in rooms with professional musicians, world-class performers, people who've spent their whole lives perfecting their craft. Some of them can play every note perfectly and still sound empty. You played with mistakes, and it was the most real thing I've heard in years." Sophie's throat was tight. "I don't understand. Why did you make me go through all that?" "Because I was testing myself," Blackwell said. "Whether I could still recognize what matters. Whether I'd become so obsessed with perfection and performance that I'd forgotten what my mother tried to teach me. That music isn't about being perfect. It's about being true." He stood up, and the others in the room seemed to collectively lean forward. "I want to make you an offer," Blackwell said. "But first I need to know something. Why did you stop playing?" Sophie looked down at her hands, the hands that had just remembered what they were made for. "Life," she said quietly. "Life happened. Tell me," Blackwell said. And somehow Sophie knew he really wanted to know. This wasn't a test anymore, so she told him everything. Sophie hadn't talked about her story in years. Not the real story. Not the parts that hurt. But sitting there in that expensive room, still wearing her waitress uniform, something made her want to tell the truth. "My dad died 5 years ago," she started, her voice quiet, but steady. "Cancer. He was a high school English teacher. Not exactly a fortune maker, but we were okay. He had life insurance. Or so we thought." She twisted her hands in her lap, remembering. Turns out there was a clause, some technicality about a pre-existing condition he didn't know he had. The insurance company denied the claim. Everything he thought he'd left us, it was just gone. And the medical bills from his final year, they were enormous. Blackwell listened without interrupting. The rest of the room was so quiet Sophie could hear the kitchen sounds from down the hall. "I was in my 2nd year at the conservatory," she continued. "Full scholarship for tuition, but I still had living expenses, books, a place to stay. My mom was working 2 jobs, but it wasn't enough. Then she got sick too. Nothing like my dad, but she needed surgery, needed treatment, needed money we didn't have." Sophie looked up at the crystal chandelier, blinking back fresh tears. "So I dropped out, sold my grandmother's piano, the one I'd learned on. It was worth about $8,000. That covered 3 months of bills. I got a job waiting tables, then another job. Then I stopped playing because every time I saw a piano, every time I heard music, it felt like looking at a life I couldn't have anymore." She met Blackwell's eyes. "That was 3 years ago. 3 years of just trying to survive. Of being practical. Of telling myself that dreams are nice but bills are real. Tonight was the first time I've touched a piano since I sold mine." The silence that followed felt heavy. Then a woman at the end of the table spoke up. She was older, maybe 60, with silver hair and kind eyes. "How much do you owe?" she asked. "For your mother's medical bills." Sophie hesitated. "I don't see how that's humor me," the woman said gently. "About $47,000, Sophie admitted. "We're on a payment plan, but the interest is killing us. And she needs another procedure next month. That's another $12,000 we don't have." The woman pulled out her phone and started typing. Another man across the table did the same. Then another. "What are you doing?" Sophie asked. Blackwell held up his hand. "Wait," he said. The woman looked up from her phone. "Done. I've sent $20,000 to the foundation account. Robert, how much are you in for?" The man she'd addressed nodded. 15,000. Michael? A younger man in an expensive suit checked his phone. I'll match Robert, 15. Sophie's head was spinning. I don't understand what's happening. You're getting your life back, Blackwell said simply. That's what's happening. Within 5 minutes, pledges had been made for over $70,000. More than enough to cover her mother's bills and the upcoming procedure. Sophie sat there, stunned, watching these strangers casually commit amounts of money that would have taken her years to save. I can't accept this, she said, even though every practical part of her brain was screaming at her to shut up and say thank you. I don't know you. I didn't play for money. You played from your soul, the silver-haired woman interrupted. Do you know how rare that is? I've attended 100 charity concerts, watched countless performances by technically perfect musicians. But what you did tonight, that was art. Real art. And art matters. Blackwell leaned forward. The money is just the beginning. I run a foundation, the Blackwell Arts Initiative. We fund artists who show exceptional promise but lack resources. We cover education costs, living expenses, whatever it takes to let them focus on their craft. He pulled out a business card and slid it across the table. I want to offer you a full funding package. We'll cover your return to the conservatory, your mother's medical expenses, living costs for the next 3 years. In exchange, you agree to 2 things. Sophie picked up the card, her fingers trembling. What things? First, you finish your education. No dropping out. No giving up. You see it through. And second, Blackwell's expression became serious. You promise to stay true to what I heard tonight. Not the first 45 minutes where you were trying to impress me. The last 5 minutes where you stopped caring what anyone thought and just played what you felt. I don't know if I can do that every time, Sophie said honestly. I was desperate. I was broken. I can't just summon that whenever I want. I'm not asking you to be broken, Blackwell said. I'm asking you to be honest. The music world is full of technically perfect performers who sound like robots. The world doesn't need another perfect robot. It needs people who are brave enough to be real. The woman with the silver hair stood up and walked over to Sophie. I'm Catherine Chen. I'm on the board of directors at the City Philharmonic. We're always looking for authentic voices. When you're ready, when you've finished your training, call me. We'll arrange an audition. A man who'd been quiet the whole evening spoke up. I own a recording studio, Northside Sound. If you ever want to record, we'll give you studio time. No charge, another woman added. I'm a music journalist. I'd love to write about your story. Only if you want, of course, but I think people need to hear about talent that almost got lost because of medical bills and bad luck. Sophie looked around the room at all these successful, powerful people and realized they were all looking at her like she was the impressive one, like she had something they wanted to see more of in the world. I need to think about this, she said, because it felt like too much, too fast. An hour ago she'd been refilling water glasses. Now she was being offered a completely different life. Of course, Blackwell said. But Sophie, let me tell you something my mother told me when I was 17, and deciding whether to go to college or stay home to help her with bills. She said, don't you dare make my struggle meaningless by refusing to take opportunities when they come. I'm fighting so you can fly, so fly. His voice had gone thick with emotion. Your father worked his whole life as a teacher. He probably didn't make much money, but I guarantee you he did it because he believed in potential, in helping people become who they were meant to be. Don't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Don't let your mother's struggle be for nothing. Take the chance. Become who you were meant to be. Sophie felt something shift in her chest. A weight she'd been carrying for 3 years starting to lift. Not all the way. She still felt scared, still felt unsure, but underneath that something else was growing. Something that felt a lot like hope. Okay, she whispered, then louder. Okay, yes, I'll do it. The room erupted in applause again. Tony was crying in the doorway. The other waitstaff were hugging each other. And Sophie sat there, still in her uniform that smelled like garlic and hard work, feeling like she'd just stepped through a door into a completely different world. But there was still one more surprise waiting for her. Blackwell hadn't told her everything yet. 1 year later, Sophie stood backstage at Preston Hall, the city's most prestigious concert venue. Her hands weren't shaking this time. They were steady, ready. She'd spent the last 12 months preparing for this moment. The year had been harder than she'd expected. Not the studying part. Not the practicing. That had been pure joy. Like coming home after being lost for years. No, the hard part had been learning to forgive herself. For giving up. For staying away so long. For believing that practical was better than passionate. Her teacher at the conservatory, Professor Williams, had told her something in their first week back. You're not the same pianist you were 3 years ago. You're better. You've lived. You've suffered. You've survived. All of that is in your playing now. Don't try to get back to who you were. Move forward to who you're becoming. Sophie had carried those words with her through every practice session. Every performance, every moment of doubt. Through the stage door, she could hear the audience settling in. 1,500 seats. All sold out. She peeked through the curtain and saw her mother in the front row, looking healthy and happy. The surgery had gone perfectly. No more pain. No more endless medical bills. Just life, simple and good. Next to her mother sat Blackwell. He'd become an unexpected mentor over the past year, checking in monthly, offering advice, challenging her to push harder. Not in the cruel way he'd pushed that first night, but in the way someone pushes you when they believe you can do more than you think you can. Tony was there too, with half the staff from the Grand Meridian. Sophie had insisted on getting them tickets. Those people had watched her at her lowest and never made her feel small. That mattered. Catherine Chen from the Philharmonic sat 3 rows back. The journalist who'd written about her story. The recording studio owner. All the people from that night who'd seen something in her worth investing in. But there were other faces too. People she'd never met. People who'd read the article. People who'd heard her story and wanted to see what happened next. Regular people who understood what it felt like to give up on dreams because life got in the way. A stage manager appeared beside her. 5 minutes, Miss Sophie. Thank you, she said, her voice calm. She thought about that night in the restaurant. How terrified she'd been. How humiliated. How broken. If someone had told her then that she'd be standing here a year later, about to perform at Preston Hall, she wouldn't have believed them. Some transformations are too big to imagine until you're standing in the middle of them. 3 minutes. Sophie closed her eyes and did what she always did before performing now. She thought about her father. Not in a sad way. In a grateful way. He'd given her the love of music. Had sat with her through countless practice sessions. Had believed in her even when she played badly. His gift hadn't died with him. It had just been sleeping. 1 minute. Ready? Ready? The stage manager opened the door and Sophie walked out into the lights. The applause was immediate and warm. She walked to the piano, a beautiful concert grand that probably cost more than her old apartment. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and looked out at the audience. For a second, she let herself feel the weight of the moment. All these people, all this expectation, all this hope. Then she let it go. Because that was the thing she'd learned. The moment you started playing for applause, you lost the thread of why you were playing it all. She began with the piece she'd played that night. Claire de Lune. But this version was different. Polished, refined. She'd spent hours working on it with Professor Williams, cleaning up the technique, perfecting the dynamics. But she'd been careful not to lose the heart of it. The truth of it. The melody floated through the hall, and Sophie felt 1,500 people lean in, listening. Really listening. She took them on a journey through grief and beauty, through moonlight and memory, through all the things that couldn't be said with words but could somehow be said with music. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. But Sophie didn't stand up to bow yet. She had more to share. Thank you, she said into the microphone that had been set up beside the piano. Public speaking still terrified her, but this needed to be said. The next piece I'm going to play is something I wrote. I've never composed before this year. Never thought I could. But my teacher encouraged me to try. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I call it The Restaurant. It's about work. About struggle. About the people who serve you dinner and the lives you never think about. It's about feeling invisible. About being tired. But it's also about finding music in unexpected places. In the clatter of dishes. In the rhythm of footsteps. In the small moments of beauty you catch between the hard parts. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play her own composition. The piece started with percussive sounds, sharp and rhythmic like plates being stacked. Then a melody emerged, tired but persistent like someone pushing through another double shift. The music built slowly, adding layers, conversations, laughter, the chaos of a busy restaurant, but underneath it all a thread of something beautiful, something human. The middle section slowed down, became more introspective. This was the lonely part, the exhausted part, the part where you wondered if this was all life would ever be. Sophie had poured her 3 years of struggle into these measures. Every late rent payment, every worried phone call with her mother, every moment of wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake giving up on music. Then the music shifted. Not suddenly, gradually, like dawn breaking. The melody that had been buried under the chaos rose up clear and strong. It was the same melody from the beginning, but transformed, not tired anymore, triumphant. It soared over the top of everything else, claiming its space, refusing to be drowned out. The piece ended with a single clear note that rang through the hall like a bell, like a declaration, like a promise. The silence that followed lasted for 3 heartbeats. Then the audience erupted. People stood, not politely, enthusiastically. Some were wiping their eyes. Sophie saw Tony in the audience, tears streaming down his face, clapping so hard his hands had to hurt. She stood and bowed, feeling overwhelmed by the response. But there was something she needed to say. She waited for the applause to quiet down. "A year ago I was serving dinner and thinking my life with music was over," she said into the microphone. "I was wrong. It wasn't over. It was just waiting for me to be brave enough to claim it again." She looked at Blackwell in the audience. "Someone once told me that life tests us to see if we remember what matters. I failed that test for 3 years. But I'm not failing anymore. This performance tonight isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's ever had to choose between dreams and survival. For everyone who's ever felt invisible. For everyone who's ever thought it was too late to start again." Her voice grew stronger. "It's not too late. It's never too late. The music doesn't leave you, it waits. And when you're ready, when you're brave enough to reach for it again, it's there. Always there." The applause came again, even louder this time. Sophie bowed one more time, then walked off stage. As she passed through the curtain, she saw her reflection in a mirror. She was still the same person who'd been terrified to play piano in a restaurant. But she was also someone new. Someone who'd learned that broken things could be rebuilt, that lost things could be found, that the worst night of your life could turn into the beginning of your best life. She heard the stage manager calling her back for an encore. The audience was still applauding, calling for more. Sophie smiled, straightened her shoulders, and walked back out into the light. She had more music to share. And this time she wasn't afraid. This time she knew exactly who she was and what she was meant to do. And that made all the difference. 3 years after that night at the Grand Meridian, Sophie sat in a coffee shop in downtown, staring at an email on her laptop. She read it 3 times to make sure she understood what it was saying. The Vienna Conservatory wanted her, not just as a student, as a guest artist and instructor. They'd heard her recordings, seen videos of her performances, read about her story. They wanted her to spend a semester teaching while continuing her own studies with some of the best musicians in Europe. It was the kind of opportunity people spent their whole lives working toward. The kind of thing that didn't happen to former waitresses from nowhere. But that was the thing Sophie had learned over the past 3 years. There was no such thing as people from nowhere. Everyone came from somewhere. Everyone had a story. And sometimes those stories made the music better, not worse. She closed her laptop and looked out the window. The city moved past in its usual rhythm. People rushing to work. Delivery trucks double-parked. A street musician playing guitar on the corner for spare change. 3 years ago, she'd felt invisible in this city, like she was just another person struggling to get by, unnoticed and unimportant. Now strangers sometimes recognized her on the street. Not fame exactly, but recognition. People who'd seen her perform. People who'd read her story. They'd stop her and say thank you. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for showing us it's possible. At first, the attention had made her uncomfortable. She didn't feel like someone worth thanking. She'd just done what she had to do, survived, then eventually lived. But over time, she began to understand what they were really saying. They weren't thanking her for being special. They were thanking her for being ordinary and doing it anyway. Her phone buzzed. A text from Blackwell. "Dinner tonight?" "Got news," Sophie smiled. Their monthly dinners had become a tradition, usually at the Grand Meridian. though now she walked through the front door as a guest instead of an employee. Tony had been promoted to general manager. He always made sure she got the best table. She texted back, 7 p.m. and I have news too. Mysterious. I like it. See you then. Sophie packed up her laptop and headed home. She lived in a small but comfortable apartment now. Nothing fancy. She could have afforded better with the money from her performances and recordings. But she'd learned something about money over the past few years. Having it didn't mean you had to spend it. Security mattered more than luxury. Half of everything she earned went into a fund she'd set up. The Sophie Chen Foundation for Artists in Crisis. It wasn't a huge foundation. Nothing like Blackwell's operation. But it was hers. Every month she helped one artist who was struggling. Paid a medical bill. Covered rent. Bought someone an instrument they couldn't afford. Small things that made big differences because she remembered. She remembered what it felt like to choose between dreams and survival. And she never wanted to forget. At home, she practiced for 2 hours. That was another thing that had changed. Practice wasn't a chore anymore. It was like breathing, like something her body needed to do to feel right. She worked on a new piece she was composing. Something about memory and how the past never really leaves us. It just transforms into something we can carry. At 6:30, she changed into a simple black dress and took a cab to the Grand Meridian. The restaurant looked the same as always. Elegant, expensive. Intimidating if you weren't used to places like this. But Sophie had stopped feeling intimidated by fancy restaurants. She'd learned that the people eating in them were just people. Some kind, some cruel, most somewhere in between. Tony met her at the door with a huge smile. Sophie, your table's ready. Mr. Blackwell arrived 5 minutes ago. How's he seem? Sophie asked. Blackwell's moods could be unpredictable. Good, really good actually. Excited about something. Sophie found him at their usual table near the window but away from the main dining room. Private but not isolated. He stood when he saw her and they hugged. That had surprised her at first, how warm he'd become. The cold testing man from 3 years ago had softened. Or maybe he'd always been soft underneath and just needed a reason to show it. You look happy, Blackwell said as they sat down. I am happy, Sophie replied. Is that allowed? It's mandatory. He poured her a glass of water. So what's your news? Sophie told him about Vienna, about the offer, about how terrified and thrilled she felt in equal measure. Blackwell listened quietly, then broke into a grin. That's incredible. Are you going to accept? I think so. But it means leaving for 6 months. Leaving my students here. Leaving my mom. Leaving everything familiar. Good, Blackwell said firmly. You should do things that scare you. That's when you grow, says the man who never seems scared of anything. I'm scared all the time, Blackwell admitted. I'm just good at hiding it. Which brings me to my news. He pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. Sophie opened it and found architectural drawings. Plans for a building. A beautiful building with large windows and open spaces. What is this? The Blackwell Center for the Arts, he said. I'm building it. 3 stories. Performance spaces. Practice rooms. Recording studios. Teaching spaces. And it's going to be free. Anyone can use it. Professional musicians, students, complete beginners. Doesn't matter. If you want to make music, you'll have a place to do it. Sophie stared at the drawings, her throat tight. I'm naming the main performance hall after you. Blackwell continued. The Sophie Chen Hall. Because you reminded me why any of this matters. Why art matters. Why we have to make space for beauty even when the world tells us to be practical. I don't know what to say, Sophie whispered. Say you'll perform at the opening. Say you'll help me run the education programs. Say you'll make sure this place stays true to what we both learned that night. Which is what? That talent isn't rare. Opportunity is rare. And our job, those of us who've been given opportunities, is to create more of them. They ordered dinner and talked for hours. About music. About the foundation. About Sophie's plans for Vienna. About Blackwell's regrets and hopes. About how strange it was that a terrible night had turned into the best thing that happened to both of them. Can I ask you something? Sophie said over dessert. Why did you really push me so hard that night? The real reason. Blackwell was quiet for a moment. Because I was angry. Not at you, at myself. I'd become someone I didn't like. Someone who valued perfection over humanity. Someone who'd forgotten why my mother worked herself to exhaustion teaching piano. It wasn't for the money. It was because she believed music made people better, kinder, more human. He stirred his coffee slowly. I saw you walking past with that tray and I thought, here's someone who's probably got a story, someone who's probably struggling. And instead of helping, my first instinct was to test you, to see if you'd break. That's who I'd become. Someone who broke people to see what they were made of. But you apologized, Sophie said. You changed. Because you showed me what I'd lost. When you played that last piece, when you stopped trying to impress me and just played what you felt. I heard my mother's voice. I heard why any of this matters. And I couldn't unhear it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. The restaurant was quieting down. Late evening. The time when the rush ended and things got peaceful. I have one more piece of news, Blackwell said finally. I'm stepping back from the company. Not retiring completely, but I'm handing over daily operations to someone else. I want to focus on the foundation, on the Arts Center, on things that matter. That's huge, Sophie said. It's terrifying, Blackwell corrected. My whole identity has been tied to that company for 30 years. But watching you rebuild your life, watching you choose meaning over security, it made me realize I've been choosing wrong. I have enough money, more than enough. What I don't have is time, and I want to spend what time I have left building things that last beyond quarterly earnings reports. Sophie reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Your mother would be proud. I hope so, Blackwell said quietly. I really hope so. They finished dinner and walked out together. The city was beautiful at night, all lit up, full of possibility. Sophie thought about that scared girl who'd sat at a piano 3 years ago, convinced her life was over. She wished she could go back and tell her, it gets better. It gets so much better, not easy, but better. Vienna is going to be amazing, Blackwell said as they stood on the sidewalk. Promise me you'll come back, though. Always, Sophie said. This is home. They hugged goodbye and Sophie walked toward the subway, past the restaurant where she used to work, past the coffee shop where she'd studied, past all the ordinary places that had witnessed her transformation. Her phone buzzed. An email from one of her students, a girl 17 whose parents wanted her to study business instead of music. The girl was asking for advice. Should she fight for her dream or be practical? Sophie smiled and typed her response as she walked. Be brave. Choose what makes you come alive. The practical path isn't always the safe one. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust that your passion has value. And if you need help, I'm here. We're all here. You're not alone. She hit send and descended into the subway, ready for whatever came next.